The Concord disaster is insane! Just a few months ago, gamers everywhere found themselves both disgusted and outraged as PlayStation's State of Play event shamelessly shoved a certain video game down consumers' throats well beyond the point of reason. Those like myself who were excited to witness a showcase of exciting, cutting-edge console games were instead left feeling betrayed and insulted as a California-based company devoted nearly half the presentation to one lifeless, obnoxiously corporate-looking game. To most onlookers, Concord embodied everything wrong with modern gaming, a hollow cash grab confirming gamers' worst fears. Sony had completely lost touch with its players, instead opting to chase predatory microtransactions and cater to what they often refer to as the modern audience, a group that, in large numbers at least, I don't believe to exist. Yet, despite the hundreds of millions poured into this disaster and Sony's desperate attempts to convince us to waste our money, something truly spectacular happened. Concord was cancelled just 12 days after its release. So with these sweet thoughts in mind, join me today as we dance on the grave of this corporate abomination, dissect its miserable history, and celebrate the beautiful truth: when it comes to capitalism, the customer is always right. I am Lady Decade, and this is why the Concord disaster is pathetic. While Concord is no longer on sale, let's be honest, it was never a game you wanted to waste your hard-earned money on anyway. While Sony is charging increasingly larger sums for some of their abhorrent offerings, fortunately I can get you thousands of AAA, modern and indie and retro games for up to 90% cheaper than elsewhere. Grab a shopping list of bargains and support independent voices such as my own simultaneously by using my affiliate links via the pinned comment. Happy shopping and enjoy your games. While hailed as a victory for gamers, the launch of Concord has been nothing short of an absolute catastrophe for Sony. However, to fully appreciate how they managed to implode under the sheer weight of their arrogance and hubris, we first need to take a step back and examine how this train wreck of a project even got off the ground. In April of 2023, The Verge reported that Sony had added a new developer to its PlayStation Studios roster, with the brand looking to push further into live service games. This new developer was an entity known as Firewalk Studios, with the article outlining that the acquisition was made to help build an original AAA multiplayer game. While at the time it was hazy as to what such a title would become, Sony's head of PlayStation Studios, Herman Hulst, would clue in fans with the current direction via a PlayStation blog post. Amongst the post, it would state, "We continue to be impressed by the team's ambitions to build a modern multiplayer game that connects players in new and innovative ways." Building up more anticipation, later in a press release he would add, "I think fans will be very pleased when they see what Firewalk has in store for them." Originally founded in 2018, Firewalk Studios, based in Bellevue, Washington, was part of Probably Monsters, a game company put together by a handful of industry veterans, led by the ever-optimistic Harold Ryan, serving as president and CEO. Even before the merger with Sony, Ryan was already making bold, if not borderline arrogant, predictions. In an interview with GamesBeat, he smugly proclaimed, "It's not surprising that Sony would turn to Probably Monsters, as the PlayStation company still makes some huge bets on blockbusters. I recently argued that AAA games aren't under siege or disappearing." If that wasn't enough, he further doubled down with, "Everything in games is getting funded. Investors are pouring money into public offerings, acquisitions, and game startups. Like there was no chance this gravy train could ever derail." And to top it off, he adds, "For me, AAA exists as a way for us to plan and ensure longer-term careers for the people that are working here." Really? Looking back at these quotes now, it's clear Harold was swimming in delusion, acting as if raking in cash from games was always going to be a guaranteed success. Honestly, it feels like I'm reading someone's hubris-filled praise of the allegedly unsinkable Titanic before its infamous tragic end. With the groundwork haphazardly slapped together for what was to come, we arrive at May 2024's PlayStation State of Play, an infamous day that will go down in history as the moment the public collectively turned its back on a multi-million-dollar disaster of a video game from the very second it was unveiled. Watching the event live, we were subjected to Concord with little context about the game's genre. Instead, we were force-fed a cringe-worthy, drawn-out cinematic set in some generic sci-fi world, filled with an awkwardly diverse cast, seemingly thrown together just to tick all the boxes. The tone was painfully reminiscent of Disney's absolute butchery of Star Wars. Concord came off like a preview for The Acolyte, another soulless pandering mess designed for modern audiences, and the safety of shareholders that would inevitably get axed because, surprise, no one wants this crap. Even though the character designs were downright hideous, there was still a sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, we'd get an epic space adventure like the glory days of Mass Effect. But, of course, that faint glimmer of optimism was obliterated in no time, as all our hopes and expectations soon came crashing down. After 5 agonising minutes of this boring cinematic, most of us felt our hearts sink as studio head Tony Hsu revealed that they'd just wasted our time by force-feeding us the backstory for a generic 5 versus 5 competitive first-person shooter. Because, you know, that's exactly the kind of game where the first thing anyone cares about is story, right? What an absolute joke. They eventually dragged us through some bland gameplay footage of what could only be described as a pathetic Overwatch knockoff, featuring a roster of the most soulless factory-produced characters imaginable. Sony wasted 10 excruciating minutes of millions of people's time, subjecting us to footage of a game so utterly unappealing, it's a wonder anyone stayed awake. Rather expectedly, after being subjected to such a show, PlayStation fans were outraged with the Concord trailer on YouTube being disliked into oblivion and a matching comment section that illustrated consumer disgust. On top of an already lifeless and painfully boring looking game, some players couldn't help but notice the blatant pandering to corporate trends. Even a robot had its pronouns obnoxiously plastered on the screen because, apparently in the dystopian world of soulless gaming, even machines need to adhere to the latest trends in identity politics. Concord was an eyesore of everything wrong with modern gaming, oozing with cringe-worthy stereotypes, from hollow diversity checkboxes to the endless barrage of microtransactions. It's like when someone took every bad idea possible, blended it into one giant mess, and slapped a price tag on it. What an absolute disaster. Backlash for this game could be found everywhere, with it increasingly becoming difficult to find any praise for this title, and by late June, the game's director of IP, Kim Crines, would reluctantly address some of the negative feedback the trailer was receiving. In an interview with VGC, when speaking about the trailer, she insinuated that players didn't like the look of the game simply as they had not seen enough of it, basically trying to claim that the trailer doesn't do what they had in store. She commented, "Yeah, that trailer, that moment was such a tiny slice of everything we've been working on for years and years. We're excited for the game and for the IP, and for the game to be in people's hands, the IP to be in people's minds. I'm personally very excited for the IP for folks to delve into the Galactic Guide, if that is something they choose to do, for these vignettes to come out on a weekly basis. You'll start to fall in love with the depth of the characters. That's something you learn week to week. Their personalities will unfold, their relationships will unfold for you, their backstories. None of that is something you can get in a tiny little slice of it. There's something there, so I'm glad folks watched it. I'm glad they participated, and I can't wait for them to see more, to see everything that is there." To give Kim the benefit of the doubt for a moment, maybe she could have been right at this point. After all, no one had played the game as of yet. However, all of that would change when Concord's early access beta was opened. Running from the 12th of July to the 14th of July 2024, despite being open to anyone who had pre-ordered the game or had been given given a code by someone else who pre-ordered the game. Embarrassingly, that ParkPlace.com would report that this game that cost hundreds of millions of dollars to produce hit a peak of 1,124 players in its first 24 hours. Reception to the gameplay was also lukewarm at best. Not at all good news for a project of this financial magnitude. A little over a month after the disappointing early access beta, an open beta for a wider audience was scheduled to begin. TrueTrophies.com reported that Concord's second free weekend on PS5 defied logic by seeing an 8% drop in players compared to the previous period. The writer of this article, Kez Elias Stevenson, who bravely admits he was looking forward to the game, would comment that while the decrease isn't significant, the drop is still unexpected given that the first beta was initially supposed to be limited to pre-orders only, and this second beta was supposed to be the open beta for all players. They would intelligently add, Concord's betas suggest players won't even return to a second beta to play for a second weekend. If Sony wants this thing to succeed, something big has to happen in the perception of this game in the month before release. Despite it becoming increasingly clear that the writing was firmly on the wall regarding this game's future, this did not prevent its developers from desperately attempting to tell us otherwise. In an interview with PC Gamer, John Wisniewski, the lead character designer for this corporate abomination, would insist that he and the rest of the team at Firewalk Studios were strapped in and ready to push it for years to come. That's right, the people who made this game thought that you were stupid enough to give them money for years. The hubris is astounding. Still, maybe all of us who were monitoring the online reception of this game were wrong. Perhaps, out in the real world, the modern audience that Firewalk Studio designed the game for wasn't imaginary and was eagerly awaiting the official launch to dive in. So, with that said, let's move on to the ridiculous launch of this game. That ParkPlace.com posted an article revealing the game's disastrous launch. In the first 4 hours, according to Steam database, the player count peaked at a pitiful 697. VG Insights estimated sales at barely 3,000 copies, while PlayTracker generously suggested 6,500. Utterly pathetic numbers for a game that's burned through hundreds of millions of dollars. An embarrassing failure by any measure. Arriving dead out the gate, it wouldn't be long until some people who worked on this rejected game would begin to take out their frustration and disappointment on the gaming public. One former Concord developer who posts from the X account with the tag @anim_Zander would initially express his excitement that the game had finally been launched, and was insanely proud that this was the first game they had worked on. Another user would respond by stating, "I'm so sorry this has to be your first. I do not believe it is you or any of the other devs' fault that this game has performed so poorly. I can tell that a lot of effort was put into completing this game, it just came out at the wrong time and genre." Rather than take the comment for what it was, Zander would angrily dismiss any negativity that existed around the game and use this as an opportunity to bash gamers. He would arrogantly respond by saying, "I don't really care. It was a huge labour from a lot of insanely talented people making an awesome game. Why would I care about a bunch of talentless freaks hating on it?" This tweet has since been deleted, but screenshots still exist of it out there. After the first weekend, Concord's player count quickly diminished and declined by an incredible 42%. That 697 peak we mentioned, which happened in the first 4 hours the game had been online, remained the same 3 days later, with this screenshot showing a peak of just over 402 over those 24 hours. On top of the low player count, some users of the game would begin complaining that there are exorbitantly long matchmaking times. That ParkPlace.com documented a Reddit user, for example, describing how bad their Concord experience has been, with them stating, "So just waited 8 mins for matchmaking and then it timed out. I love the game and want to play it. Unfortunately, I can't wait 8 mins plus between games. Decided to play something else and come back on peak hours. This really doesn't look promising at all." As documented earlier, prior to the game's release, many gamers slammed Concord's design, saying it resembled nothing more than a lazy checkbox-driven corporate exercise. They argue that the game is an insipid, soulless attempt to cram in as much diversity as possible, with no regards for creativity or authenticity, merely pandering to perceived modern trends that few who live in the real world would care about. Adding fuel to the fire, thepinknews.com would later report that one of the main characters was modelled after Jamila Adderley, a black transgender activist known for the song It's Raining Them.
This is great banter. It really is.
I can see why the inclusion of such a character who is so clearly tied to identity politics would feel like a cynical corporate ploy to appear politically correct and safe to shareholders. Although, let's be fair, I'm pretty sure the shareholders would have preferred a game that people actually liked and didn't get cancelled. Simply stuffing a title full of checkboxes for diversity doesn't automatically make a game better. Audiences are looking for rich narratives, engaging gameplay, and immersive worlds. When a game starts to prioritise ticking off social or political agendas over these essential aspects, it instantly alienates a significant portion of its player base who feel patronised and turned off by such blatant pandering. I can't believe how many times I need to say this regarding modern games, but diversity for diversity's sake, especially when it feels forced or tokenistic, rarely results in meaningful engagement, making this strategy not just creatively bankrupt, but commercially short-sighted as well. There is certainly a place for activism, but is it really in $100 million commercial product that needs to turn astronomical profits to survive? I'll leave you to answer that one. Less than 2 weeks after this game's official launch, PlayStation would formally pull the plug on Concord, not only shutting down the game but offering everyone who had paid for it a full refund in the process. The market for this game just doesn't exist. Across the internet, many celebrated, feeling that their voice had finally been acknowledged, or at the very least, that their wallets had made an impact, contributing to Concord's downfall. Many game journalists, though, would take issue with such a stance. Kenneth Shepard from Kotaku.com, for example, commented, "Whether you like Concord or not, this should rattle you. Sony and Firewalk spent a lot of time and money on this game as part of its big live service push, and it's flopping so hard that Sony is pulling the plug before it can even hit its 1-month anniversary. The PlayStation fan in me hopes that if all of this comes crashing down regardless, someone at Sony realises this cannot continue and is righting the ship as we speak." Following the demise of Concord, YouTube channel Hero Hey would highlight a number of deleted tweets supposedly from Amanda Kiefer, a senior concept artist at Firewalk Studios, who responded to another tweet from an individual stating they want to try redesigning Concord characters essentially just for fun. Such a tweet seems to be driven by the fact that the characters look unappealing is one of the many reasons the mass public didn't like the look of the game. Amanda allegedly bitterly responded saying, "I was going to DM you after seeing this, but this site makes me pay to do that. So at the risk of getting dogpiled, I'm just going to say this here. A lot affected the art side of Concord, including design by committee failure of some leadership to listen to the art team, etc. The character concept art team, including myself, is going through an extremely difficult time emotionally, and some of the team no longer want to work in games, design characters, or even do art anymore after this. Because of this, posts like yours, though understandable, are unfortunately ill-timed. None of us know which way the wind will blow with the studio. We are worried, sick and terrified of the future. Not only that, but we have been shouldering the brunt of the emotional labour as executives/directors dodge most of the blame. Behind the scenes of all this talk about Concord and character designs, people's livelihoods are at risk, and there are very real financial consequences that might hurt us even more. That's just what I can say from our point of view. I'm not saying change a course or anything. Us artists like being able to use social media to promote our work and get more jobs. But I am saying we see this and it does absolutely affect us since we just got our teeth kicked in. While layoffs, financial struggles and emotional strain are valid concerns, Kiefer's reference to emotional labour and the idea that executives are dodging responsibility while artists bear the brunt of the consequences can come across as a guilt trip. It attempts to shift sympathy towards the artist rather than focusing on the larger issue of why the game failed. The tweets emphasise victimhood instead, rather than the issue of a $100 million game being developed that hardly anyone wants to play. One thing is for sure though, no matter who's to blame in this situation, Concord is not a financially viable game. PCGamer.com would be another publication that would choose to bash gamers rather than mock the mega corporation trying to shove a subpar product down everyone's throats. Siding against their own reader base, they would chastise gamers, stating the eagerness to grave dance on unpopular games has become a bad habit. They would add that jubilation over Concord's low turnout derives to some degree from an I told you so sense of justice. The idea that out-of-touch, creatively bankrupt executives are cynically chasing trends, and that the rest of us would have had the common sense to avoid releasing a Concord. But it's not actually that easy to know why one game succeeds and another doesn't. My guess at the real reason for all of this grave dancing is that it feels like a victory over FOMO. Beating up on unpopular games is also a way to passively farm a satisfying sense of vindication. If I never paid attention to a game that fails at launch, it affirms the correctness of my judgment and the immaculacy of my taste without any effort on my part. Either way, the reflex to cheer for Concord's failure, as if it's deserved, only produces resentment and misunderstandings, creating an environment where everything is deemed obvious and real analysis is drowned out in favour of shareable quips, surface-level observations, and hyperbole. Regarding all of this, in my opinion, the journalists' claim that gaming communities revel in the downfall of games is a condescending oversimplification that blatantly ignores valid consumer complaints. The critique against games, especially those that fail to live up to the hype, often originates from genuine frustration with industry malpractices like overpromising and under-delivering or ignoring customer feedback. Something that the PlayStation brand has been incredibly guilty of over the years, which makes it feel all the more shocking that they were unable to make Concord in some way work. To dismiss Concord's criticisms as nothing more than schadenfreude overlooks the real issues of gamers feeling cheated or sidelined by corporate giants, casting their legitimate grievances as trivial or baseless. After all, the customer is always right, including in this instance, so this journalist should not feel as though they know better. The idea that criticising a failed game is just an easy way to affirm one's taste without effort completely overlooks the significance of critical dialogue in propelling the industry forwards. Surely a so-called game journalist, or as they like to call themselves, critics, should know better than this, right? You'd think so at least. Despite the death of Concord, another large component in the game's narrative that Sony has largely ignored is that, according to the game's lead character designer John Wisniewski, the title has been in development about 8 years before now, meaning Concord, in some form at least, was in the works years before Sony acquired Firewalk. Considering the timing, this might shed some light on why such a painfully tone-deaf and outdated game concept was dragged out in 2024, despite it being an embarrassing and cliché mess from every angle. Everything about Concord reeks of stale, outdated ideas, like someone lazily dug it up from the graveyard of forgotten concepts that should have been left to rot. It's almost laughable that when companies like Sony claim to be making games for a modern audience, they're so out of touch that they think today's gamers are still stuck in 2016, clinging to the same tired trends. It's a testament to how little they've evolved. The disconnect between their supposed modern audience and what gamers actually want now is embarrassing, and Concord is a perfect example of their staggering failure to read the room. Don't forget, you can get up to 90% off thousands of games using my affiliate links, or if you fancy supporting my work in a more personal way, get access to my cosplay library and more via becoming a backer over on Patreon. I'll see you over there soon.